He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday and Friday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content such as interviews and D&D campaigns at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
Welcome to Cryptid Clues, everybody. I'm your host, Reuben Olson, joined by your other also host, Taylor Field. Today's episode doesn't actually exist unless you believe it does. And since you're listening, that must mean you believe. So head on over to CryptidClues.ca and manifest more episodes from us simply by looking for them. Ask us questions over at our email, cryptidclues@gmail.com. And if you like what you hear, support us on Patreon for $1 or more for ad-free, exclusive content and D&D episodes at patreon.com/CryptidClues. Finally, you can find us on almost all social media. Now, Taylor, I'm going to get into a very interesting and deep topic today, and it's going to be littered with rabbit holes. So I might seem like a magician just pulling rabbits out of a hat here, but I'm going to blow our minds as best as I can. Are you ready for this?
Oh yeah, I'm ready.
All right. Before I can even introduce the topic, which will be posted in the episode's title, but before I can officially talk about it, I want to back it up with the theory of collective consciousness. So, the theory of collective consciousness, which is a small part of this episode, is a crucial and vital one to understand. Collective consciousness is the set of shared beliefs, ideas, and moral attitudes which humanity operates on and unifies the majority of our species. Think about how much in common social norms are, how we bond through memes, religion, and more. How when a group of people gather at a party or social event, an entire community that shares similar interests kind of temporarily merges on a grander scale, as if each person is a cell inside of a larger brain. If you were a higher being looking down at a disco rave, people inside would kind of look like a bunch of ants inside a large colony with one singular purpose to dance. And that's a rushed explanation of collective consciousness for sure, but the idea of a hive mind isn't an uncommon one. And while we certainly aren't there in the alien sense, since we still possess individuality, the social mind is something that brings large divisions of people together and unites them under separate banners, which has been quite a thing for the past few years. Now, think about what unites people under these different banners. Perhaps several groups of people have differences, but all or some of them have the same or similar religion. Now you can end up uniting those separate banners on a grander scale. We end up creating these connections and string together a web of concepts that create a baseline for what the world is today, which is our reality. So, since time began, humanity has been fascinated with both the spiritual and physical worlds. And altering reality is a concept many people wish they could achieve. Taylor, if you could, would you alter reality in any way?
I absolutely would.
And I think that goes for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
If you could alter reality, if you could change something, go back in time, Back to the Future style, or just snap your fingers and change things, pretty much everybody would jump at the chance. I don't think that there's very few people that would probably just leave things the way they are. So it's been an obsession for our species for a long time. Now, one of the many, many tests that were conducted to show the power of belief was the use of a quantum-based random number generator, which I have brought up briefly in the past before, quite some time ago. And I shouldn't really say that there's just one experiment. There's actually hundreds of tests using these random number generators that have been performed around the world to showcase basically a subset of quantum mechanics. It's very unsupported by science because quantum mechanics is now accepted, but even quantum mechanics is like, we're just breaching the surface, and it's very easy to get confused with it. Starting in the 1960s, researchers began using random number generators to study the effect humans had on the outcome of these random number generators simply by believing in an outcome over another. So, by observing and believing that this random number generator would generate a higher or a smaller number, groups of researchers found that while a random number generator should truly and utterly be random if left alone, which it was, once observed, the likelihood of randomness just changed a little bit. Just a tiny little bit out of the norm. And it looked like people were able to affect the outcome of these generators based on how many other people were around believing in the same outcome. Higher numbers, lower numbers. It was a lot harder for people to say, oh, the outcome is going to be number 97. No. It's either from 1 to 100, the outcome is going to be above 50 or below 50. And that seemed to make it stick. So a little bit more of a broader belief, but shared amongst their peers, created a more consistent result. Now, it would then seem to prove that, at least in some form, on a minuscule scale, human beings are either psychic enough to change the way a machine works by thinking about it really, really hard, or that reality is in some way affected by our individual beliefs and drastically affected the more we believe in it a certain way.
So is this a psychic collective consciousness to a degree actually imprinting itself into like the code of a machine or a technology, or is it just not kicking in till the end result? Like, is it affecting the production of this result, or is it manipulating what the output is, I guess? Like, at what stage does it affect?
Well, that's kind of the whole point of the experiment. And the answers are very, very unclear, but the outcome is measured. So you can see the outcome and you can go, well, something happened here. And it looks like this group of people affected the outcome. But why or how, we don't know. And of course, this is a really strange concept. So what does it have to do with our show? Well, besides pulling a rabbit out of the rabbit hole instead of the hat, this is the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, and perhaps the grandmother of all of them. And it allows me to more readily explain today's topic. Tulpas. A tulpa is a concept known throughout the realm of the paranormal and mysticism and so on. Have you ever heard of a tulpa, Taylor?
I have, yes. Through you.
Through me. What is a tulpa from what you remember?
From what I remember, it just is, it's a form of connected consciousness, is it not?
So a tulpa is an object or being created through spiritual or mental powers.
Right.
An easier explanation of that is something that many of us did as a kid. An imaginary friend.
Right. Yes.
That really boils it down to what a tulpa is. So, while the concept of a tulpa in the spiritual sense goes deep into Buddhism and medieval Indian history, the concept of thought forms or tulpas that I'm going to talk about today is just the concept of a person able to create an object or person-like entity in their mind, eventually leading into creating that person or entity in their vision and opening up the door to either some kind of hallucination or some kind of created being that becomes ensouled or ensnared by the paranormal. Tulpas at their most powerful are believed by practitioners to exist in their peak in the astral plane, where they can be physically interacted with or seen by others that practice the art. Now, I know as a kid, I definitely had imaginary friends, and I was the only person able to see them or hear them or interact with them. And even as a child, I knew they weren't really there. I think just in my mind alone, as a kid, your imagination is so powerful, you can almost imagine things around you. And as an adult, I definitely have a harder time doing that. I feel disconnected from that ability now. But I remember it. I definitely remember being able to go, yeah, you know what? I'm 5 years old. I'm going to go play with my imaginary friend. It's a giant beaver. Stupidest thing I know, but that was my imaginary friend growing up. Taylor, did you have any imaginary friends?
If I did, it's something that I do not remember. And thinking back, being in that younger age range, I don't really think that it was something that I was just out to do. Just imagine like, hey, yes, I have this individual here that only I can see, only I can speak to. It's not something that I really recall, again, unless it's suppressed, but it's not something I recall myself actively doing when I was younger. I guess I'm not talented.
Maybe. Plot twist, I'm your imaginary friend, and this is a very silent episode for the listeners. Can you imagine that? After about, 8 minutes or so, you say a couple sentences, and people are just like, man, what is this show?
So you and your family have just been all my imaginary friends this whole time.
Or it could be the other way around, and it's significantly less quiet this episode, but every Friday it's basically just silence for an hour.
Just silence, yeah.
So, people who practice this scary art eventually succumb to a fear of the being that they let loose. At least a lot of them do, not all of them. A spiritualist by the name of Alexandra David Need stated that she observed these practices in Tibet. But after creating a tulpa herself, it eventually took on a mind of its own and broke free from her control and had to be destroyed. That's a little spooky. I don't like that. Many practitioners also report the same thing. I'm having trouble pronouncing just regular old words at this point. Now, these practitioners believe that if they believe in their tulpa hard enough, it begins to communicate with them, or I'm just going to refer to practitioners as a host from now on because that makes it even more fantastic. Parasitic almost. They believe that it eventually begins to communicate with the host seemingly without influence or the desire to make it speak, as if this tulpa has a mind of its own, developing a personality unintended from the creator. Doesn't that sound like something out of like a horror movie?
Oh, absolutely. This is the script for a horror film. Like as you speak it.
Yeah, I feel like this could make a really great horror movie. Holy. And interestingly enough, surveys conducted in people who claim to be able to manifest tulpas, it was found that autism, ADD, and ADHD traits are significantly higher among these so-called tulpamancers than the general population. Perhaps due to a higher level of loneliness, these groups of people simply desire a friend or an ad break. Welcome back, everybody. Maybe there was no ad break and you just imagined it.
You just reminded me greatly about where, again, the term tulpa. There was again, with Geekverse, and talking about movies and stuff like that, for Halloween, we dived into a movie called The Empty Man. And this is a horror film that came out in 2020. And the base premise is tulpas, actually. And I totally forgot that the connection here between that film and what you're describing now, basically short form in that movie, they needed to, this group manifest consciously an actual being, and they created this being and gave this individual like these memories and all these different things. So it's very much in line with exactly how you've just described it. Is it a great movie? That's debatable, but tulpas.
I mean, if you go back even further, there's the concept of like golems and stuff like that people could make out of mud or dirt and then draw some little scribbles on and it comes to life. In a sense, that's almost like a tulpa as well. But with everything that I have discussed so far, we've kind of just been talking about tulpas in the very modern sense. But how and why is it still around, especially on the internet, it seems? The most recent practice of tulpas, in the more conventional sense, still stems from the Tibetan Buddhism, where monks primarily create a tulpa to overcome attachments, such as phobias or desires. Just let me think of an example, like if a monk had a fear of spiders, the tulpa created might have approached a spider fearlessly and show there's nothing to fear. Monks would meditate on the experience and then make their tulpas disappear once their purpose has been served. That seems to be a general rule among them as well in the Buddhism. If you make a tulpa, use it for its purpose and quickly get rid of it. Almost like there's a greater risk the more you keep one around. And that takes me back to Alexander and her experience. She created a tulpa of a fellow monk. And she practiced it until her vision grew in clarity and substance, till she had difficulty distinguishing it from reality. She kept her practice pretty secret. None of her friends knew about it. And eventually, her monk tulpa appeared when she wasn't willing it to. And it interacted with her in ways that she did not desire. Alexandra's companions in Tibet began to ask about the stranger that she had occasionally been seen with when she thought she was alone. And at this point, when the other monks were commenting on this random stranger monk that seemed to be following her around, she got a little spooked and decided it was time to stop and practiced reabsorbing the tulpa. And according to her, it was very unwilling and fought her for several weeks.
Oh my gosh.
Finally, she was able to make it dissipate back inside of her, and she was exhausted for a long, long time. What are your thoughts on that, Taylor?
That is terrifying. The amount of time and power that would be required to actually dissolve something like that, I could imagine be, like you said, exhausting. You would have a lot of downtime following something like that, especially because this thing has garnered enough strength to identify itself as its own being to a certain degree, where it's being seen by other people now. That would be a lot of power to manifest itself in such a way.
And this isn't really in my notes here, but it's something I kind of wanted to bring up because it's something I usually bring up when we're talking about spooky cryptids or paranormal or spiritual stuff. You think that eventually there's a point you create something that's an empty shell like this, and when it starts to take on a mind of its own, it's been possessed by a spirit or a demon of some kind?
Sorry, was that a question?
Yeah, kind of.
Oh. When you create something, it takes on the form of being like a more demonic or like a scary entity. That's what you're referring to?
No. Just like you create a tulpa, and then eventually it takes on a mind of its own. Now, is it still necessarily you that's thinking about it, or do you think it's like another spirit or something that's controlling it?
I think that there are many different, I don't know if I want to say avenues, but outlets that other things that maybe have negative notions are keeping their gaze upon, waiting for the right moment to kind of latch on. And I think that stems from human beings being in a position where we're capable of a lot of spiritual things, and these other things that are either deceased or just not of our reality and dimension are just waiting because they want to have access to this. They want to be a part of what we have. And so when we use our abilities to conjure something or do something, they know how to take full advantage of that. So I think it's more so an outlying negative force than it is our inner selves reflecting outward into like a tulpa, if that were to make sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree. And of course, since we're talking about things like spirits or demons possessing these or whatever, let's play devil's advocate and also just say, hey, in a maybe more real sense for most people, this whole tulpa scenario could just be mental illness. You're practicing something, you believe in it so hard. It's a lot like how people feel about most religions. You're believing in something, you think it's real, but it's not really happening. At a certain point, you can hallucinate it and you think it's really there. Now, that kind of just feels like I'm taking the whole Tulpa thing, crumpling it up, and throwing it in the garbage, and I don't really stand there with that. I'm very open-minded about the concept and, of course, everything we talk about in general. But what effect does this tulpamancy have for society? Well, when we look at the idea that there's a possibility that we can create something so intensely in our own minds, and then look at the idea that reality appears to be able to shift on a small scale when affected by belief in a group of individuals, what does it mean on the grand scale of things? What happens when an entire planet believes in something? Do you think that if reality is in any way based on our beliefs or a simulation or whatever theory you have, do you think it's constantly changing and rewriting itself, going all the way back through history and retconning things? Let me bring you back a ways. Before we touch on that, let me bring you back into childhood. Let's go back in time to the concept that we're very familiar with. The concept of Bigfoot to most people is maybe the Patterson-Gimlin film and a few hoaxes and unsolved mysteries. The concept of lake monsters is a blurry one. Berenstain Bears is spelled with an S-T-E-I-N in your childhood. But as time passes, interest in something like Bigfoot perhaps grows among the population that's currently on this planet. The population that blissfully watched Patterson-Gimlin film on TV as a child. And the brain is a powerful thing, and imagination really opens the doors of possibility. The spelling of a children's book, however, becomes less commonplace and begins to fade away into obscurity. Now, a huge chunk of the population actually believes in the possibility of a giant man-like creature roaming the forests, and the possibility of it existing, therefore, increases. A smaller, less powerful group of people remember how to spell the name of a children's book, and an argument sprouts online saying, hey, how is it spelled? Sparks a massive debate, and somebody Googles a picture of the book and firmly places in reality that it is now spelled S-T-A-I-N. In this instance, we have opened Schrodinger's box. We peered inside to find an answer. Are you familiar with Schrodinger's cat?
I am familiar.
Okay, well, for the sake of our listeners, and for those unaware, Schrodinger's cat is a quantum mechanic thought experiment. That's a fancy name. The concept in its simplest form is, if there is a box with a cat inside, hypothetically, that cat can either be alive inside the box or dead. Until somebody opens the box to find out, the cat is in both a state of alive and dead at the same time until the discoverer opens the box and creates the scenario where the cat is either alive or dead. So, I ask you the question. Do you think we've believed hard enough to retcon reality? Are conspiracy theories the gateway openings that eventually alter reality or create new Mandela effects? If we now believe Bigfoot is a bigger possibility than ever before and start exploring history for the first time, are we going to find proof that was never there? I never heard of the medieval wild man until I decided to check it out.
So when you say the proof that was never there, are you implying that we have consciously created that proof and rewritten and retconned it where, like you said, you didn't know about the medieval wild man when you were a kid, but now this medieval wild man information and notion has just manifested based on this?
Exactly. It's everywhere. You go back through medieval European history and there's this Bigfoot stuff littered about. How did that get there?
With this ad break. And we're back. So I never even thought of applying that to such things like cryptids and even the Berenstain Bears, like Mandela effect process as well. That's a very interesting consensus.
I feel like it's a unprovable but very good answer. So it's a theory in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So in the end, it's like saying the moon landing was faked. And because it was presented in such a believable way, reality was then altered to allow for this possibility. Whereas we grew up, the moon landing was real, and now it's potentially faked. That theory is out there. A lot of people believe in it. It's almost like you have two groups of people living in two different realities at the same time until one set decides to believe hard enough that it becomes reality. And it really begs the question when you're looking into things like these, say you're looking into the moon landing and you go, well, why? Why was it faked? That opens up another can of worms. We create scenarios involving our governments being filled with secret societies and greedy, sinister conspiracies. The plot only ever seems to deepen.
So, are we to blame then for this?
It sure feels like it.
Yeah, I'd say we were the bad ones. So, would our governments be good and pure and best interest for the people if it's not the fault of the people to then be just saying, oh, our governments are the problem, they're bad, and we're manifesting this evilness amongst the like politicians and such?
Exactly.
Oof. It's hard to snap out of that kind of mindset because I mean, some of them are pretty grimy.
Right? It's very convincing to go into that point of view after having heard all of this.
No kidding.
Anyways, that's pretty much everything that I had for my notes. So, Taylor, if you have some closing thoughts, maybe we can explore a couple other questions, but otherwise, that's it for me.
So, you touched upon this very, very briefly, but the notion of this being just a collective consciousness and we can just kind of people can come together and they can combine their thoughts and just follow into the same kind of trajectory for something and to manifest something. So is leading into the retconning of history, is this us accessing a simulation, a grid, or are we changing a reality? Like how would you examine that? Is it a simulation created by a higher being? Is this a reality that's just one of an unending, infinite amount of realities that's being recoded, or that maybe we're branching off into another one and combining with another one that's we've manifested into, or something along those lines? What do you think?
Well, since we don't know the answer, I suppose all of those possibilities are possible at the same time. Now, I'd like to liken that to the whole, if the universe was like a simulation theory, let's liken it to the development of an artificial intelligence. There's some really good ones out there. OpenAI in general has some really fluid, crazy ones right now that you can talk to, ask it to write a novel or make like a biblical type scripture. And it's indistinguishable. You can't look at it anymore and go, I'm talking to a bot. And now you talk to an artificial intelligence on the internet, and it's very hard to trip it up where you can point at it and go, that is not a human being writing that. But it didn't start that way. And when you ask these artificial intelligence questions like this, you realize they're just gathering information. They're slowly becoming smarter and smarter because they have more knowledge built up within them. But they were programmed by human beings. But human beings aren't programming more language into it. The AI is gathering it itself, and it's kind of, therefore, developing itself. There's more code being added to, I guess you could say, its brain or its database or whatever. And if humanity decides to believe in a certain topic, it's kind of like it's coding it in there, if that makes any sense. But that's about all I have for that.
So in another example, because that does make sense, another example of this then, would you say the usage of a Ouija board, which I refuse to use a freaking Ouija board, using that, it's the same, would it be the same kind of premise as, okay, you have, hypothetically, you and me, we're using a Ouija board and our thoughts are all focused on a question to yield an answer. Maybe our thoughts are all focused on yielding that answer. Maybe you're just focused or I'm just focused on either or. We're concentrated. Are we manifesting the results of using this Ouija board, or are we using the Ouija board to create a tulpa, sort of speak? Is it just like a Western or like cheesy way of accessing this?
That's really scary to think about. In a sense, with you and me using one of those things, that's very dangerous because my mind would instantly go to, well, it could be a demon, right? That's a scary thing to have around. You might think, well, it could be, we could be contacting a ghost. If we're believing in contacting somebody in particular, we're creating that likelihood. At the same time, if these theories we're discussing are not reality, and this is just conspiracy theory and everything, we're just believing in something so hard and moving our hands and creating a hallucination that we're just tricking ourselves.
Yeah, fair enough. I don't think I have any other follow-up questions. I think that's all I got for now. But this is a fascinating subject.
I guess you believe that this episode is ending.
I believe so. I'm glad that you mentioned the tulpas, and you mentioned that how this can apply to retconning history, where it can connect in so many different avenues into cryptids and the Mandela effect. I was not thinking that at all at the start, and it's just another great example of how really intertwined these things are, more so than people in these selective fields want to believe. Because I think people can get really kind of stuck in this state of mind, like Bigfoot doesn't go into like the quantum realm, doesn't go invisible, that kind of thing. Like at the end of the day, we don't know, like you've said throughout this episode, so we can't really come to that conclusion. And I don't mean that as any offense to anyone or be blunt. That's just how I see it, but we really don't know.
Just like we really don't know that this episode is about to end in 20 seconds. Taylor, take us away.
Ladies and gentlemen, you can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca. You can reach us directly with our email, CryptidClues@gmail.com. Patreon, where you can get ad-free, early exclusive episodes, and our social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. And with that, take care and stay safe.
Bye-bye.